British Prime Minister Keir Starmer has taken a leading role in new security efforts in Europe and the West as ties between the United States and its allies fray. 5 years after the UK left the European Union, he's aiming for a big reset with the bloc based on mutual defence. And with his good relations with Donald Trump, he's hoping to play the role of bridge builder between the EU and the US.
The UK's nuclear submarines is a source of considerable national pride. Apart from France, the UK is Europe's only nuclear power, paramount for the continent's security. A group of UK members of parliament have just visited Estonia and Finland. Fred Thomas, a former Royal Marine, was one of them. They were given a very positive reception by military leaders, he says.
Us and France provide a nuclear shield, along with America, for Europe, but also we have a special relationship for intelligence sharing with the US, with Canada, Australia, with the Five Eyes. And that gives us a unique strategic advantage to be able to make Europe very safe.
The UK's military power make the country an important ally for European leaders. Keir Starmer is seeking to negotiate access for British companies to a massive new European defence programme. And he wants smoother trade relations with the bloc.
It's now 5 years ago that the UK has left the European Union. And since then, the country has been sitting a bit awkwardly on the sidelines, not a member of the club anymore. But all this seems to be changing since President Trump has come to power. And the UK is finding a new purpose.
Starmer is walking a tightrope, staying close to President Trump, flattering him in public, and at the same time reaching out to European allies.
We've lent in and said we'll play our part.
It has allowed the UK explicitly, in the case of the US, to say, OK, we're going to be in between the two, and we're going to try not to take sides. That may be impossible to sustain, but Brexit has allowed the UK to do that.
The UK Prime Minister is bringing together the so-called coalition of the willing, coordinating military help for Ukraine.
We are at a crossroads in history today. This is not a moment for more talk. It's time to act, time to step up and lead, and to unite around a new plan for a just and enduring peace.
But the UK has also been relying on the US with its intelligence sharing. The so-called special relationship between the two countries goes back decades. It's not something Keir Starmer would admit to today, but at some point in the future, the UK might have to choose between the US and the EU.
The US has stopped being a reliable ally, and the UK and the EU have been given a lot of reason to think about the common interest that they have, which goes beyond security to the economy, to culture and so on. So I think they have been reminded of that.
For the time being, Keir Starmer is doing everything he can not to alienate the US, but it's clear that at the same time, he's pivoting closer to Europe.
Well, our correspondent Birgit Maass filed that report, and Birgit joins me now from London. Birgit, great to see you. So this is a new role for the United Kingdom. Is the UK moving closer to the European Union again?
It's definitely a much friendlier tone. What the UK is not going to do, Keir Starmer has made that clear. He's not going to try and rejoin the EU. He's not going to accept freedom of movement between its citizens. However, what he is called is called a reset. That's what he is aiming for in relations with the European Union. There's a big summit for the end of May, and he's hoping to essentially remove a lot of Brexit trade barriers and create generally a much more friendly relationship with the former partners. And defence is an important part in this because he can use that as leverage.
All right, so is the UK able and willing then to fill the security gap that could potentially arise in Europe?
The UK sees itself as an important military power in the European context. It was mentioned nuclear, together with France, the only European nuclear power, and also intelligence sharing with the US. So the UK intelligence community is very well in touch with the US and other Western partners. So in one way, that is a plus, or it used to be a plus until now. Now the cards are slightly being shifted again, and some people are questioning whether it could actually be a minus. The UK nuclear submarine rockets, for example, are made in the US and also maintained in the US. And people are questioning, like you've heard in the report, whether the US remains a reliable ally. So that casts doubt on the state of the British military and on its might. There's also the state of the British Army. A former defense secretary has admitted that essentially it's been hollowed out, too many cuts, and an important military think tank said that it can do some things well, but not on an impressive scale. So in a European context, the British Army is still strong, but it definitely, the UK also has its weaknesses.
Now, we've mentioned this so-called coalition of the willing. Remind us what it's all about for Ukraine, for example.
Well, it's a signal, first and foremost, I think, also to the Trump administration that Europe is taking charge, that Europe is making steps towards being able to look after its own security, not just rely on the US. And that was very, very important moment when Keir Starmer basically took the helm of and created the so-called coalition of the willing very quickly after there was this debacle in the White House with President Zelensky. So he acted quickly, and a lot of politicians and even politicians from his own opposition admired that he did that. However, he is insisting that there needs to be a US backstop. So it is a coalition of the willing led by the UK, but they're all insisting it can't be entirely without the US.
All right, we'll leave it there. Thanks, Birgit. DW correspondent Birgit Maass in London.
And Gesine Weber specialises in European security and defence issues at the German Marshall Fund of the United States. She joins us from Paris. Welcome to DW. Can Britain really act as a bridge between Europe and the US? Surely the US has demonstrated that it will serve its own interests regardless of what its supposed allies think.
It's indeed a good question whether the UK will succeed to some extent this balancing act between the United States and Europe, and whether it can act as a bridge without alienating either side. But I would say that at the moment, the UK has been rather successful in this endeavor, not only because the UK has played a leading role when it comes to European support for Ukraine since the very beginning of Russia's full-scale invasion in 2022, but also because it seems that British Prime Minister Starmer has built already a relatively good relationship with the US President Donald Trump. And this personal relationship is just something that we know is in general pretty important. So at the moment, it looks indeed as if he might be able to succeed with this endeavor.
But where's the substance? You say he's built a personal relationship with Donald Trump. We see that Donald Trump loves his personal relationships until it interferes with what Donald Trump wants to do. So where can you look at and say, yes, Starmer and Britain have done this well because Donald Trump would have done that before, but now, because Keir Starmer's whispered in his ear, he hasn't?
At the moment, it is indeed still a bit complicated to find a palpable success of this Trump whispering, or however you want to call it, because indeed what Europeans want at the very moment is a seat at the negotiations table when it comes to Ukraine's future, and we have not seen such an initiative. But we see that the Frankish-British proposal for a so-called reassurance force and also reflections on a potential deployment of Europeans on the ground are taken serious by the United States, and that they might become part of the negotiations. So that is probably the most Europeans can get from the United States at the moment.
Where is the evidence that the United States, and importantly Russia, is taking this idea of a reassurance force seriously?
At least we have seen in statements by US President Trump that the idea is apparently on the table, and this idea of a European force, whatsoever might be its final form, is at least being discussed between Moscow and Washington. which means that they do not totally disregard this proposal. But indeed, we do not know to what extent this could actually take shape, whether it is just a rhetorical bargaining chip or whether it is actually something that is seriously considered. And it also comes with a problem, which is that Europeans themselves are not part of these negotiations.
Right, so you have Europe not at the table while negotiations are being conducted, and you have Russia saying quite clearly that it will not countenance the presence of European or NATO troops in Ukraine. So where is the value in all this talk?
At the moment, it is very important for Europeans to signal their readiness to take care of European security and defense. I think it is very clear that we see that Europeans would only deploy whatsoever force only after a peace agreement. And to be very realistic, the so-called reassurance force could most likely not fully monitor the implementation of a ceasefire. So these troops would rather be there to potentially conduct training, or at the moment, the idea is that it could focus on air defense or the maritime space. But indeed, it still seems very, very far away to see any kind of deployment if Russia openly opposed that, even if European leaders say, or like French President Macron also said, that they do not need Russian consent. So I think that this deployment is not going to come if there is no agreement between the US and Russia that this could be tolerated.
Understood. Thank you so much for guiding us through that. Gesine Weber from the German Marshall Fund of the United States.